Hi, everybody. Sean here. I just wanted to do kind of a little pre-introduction. First of all, to apologize because, well, I thought this was going to be an easy episode to record. It turns out this was actually very difficult. Recording and especially editing this down and laying it out and everything proved to be quite a cumbersome task, and I don't know why. So I apologize especially to those who subscribe over YouTube because this is going to be late, at least on YouTube. And also, I just wanted to say there have been many times on this podcast when I've talked about certain products and possibly services that you could use to enhance your record listening experience and your storage and everything. And adding that I get a little piece of the money if you go through these Amazon links. This time, I'm going to ask you to do something else. If you are about to make some kind of upgrade to your turntable or do some other things that normally you would do to maintain your record collection, if it can wait, I want to suggest that you hold off and instead take the money you were going to spend and donate it to help those in need in and around Los Angeles. I will put a link or two in my show notes to at least one confirmed site that will accept your donations. You know it won't be a scam. And keep in mind that despite what might be presented to you on the surface, it's not just rich and famous Hollywood celebrities that have lost things. It is also everyday people like me, and I'm assuming many of you, who are also hurting. So anything you could do to help out, I know it would be greatly appreciated. And now that I've said that, here is episode 14 of My Weird Record Collection. So, you're interested in learning about those records. You want your stylus to last longer. Well, sit back and listen carefully. The stories, descriptions, and opinions about these audio oddities are contained in this episode. The host, Sean Courtney, is a record collecting finalist. In this episode, Sean reveals the strategies and tips about video games as provided by Curtis Hoard. So listen well and learn from him how you too can have questionable taste in records, have minutes of fun, and build your own weird record collection. Good luck. God knows you'll need it.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
Ross Alhambra intersection at 15000. Contact Los Angeles Center, 2 minutes northeast of the station.
Happy New Year, those of you listening in the present. It is 2025, and this is episode 14 of My Weird Record Collection. I'm Sean, coming to you from Chicago, and I'm inviting you to join me in my world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. Coming to you today is a record from 1982 called Conquer the Video Craze by Curtis Hoard. Hope you all had a good holiday, a good start to the winter, a good whatever it is that you've had. Personally, for me, I had quite an influx. Well, I don't know if I want to say influx, but I had some nice hauls, as you could say. Walked out of my neighborhood record store, Rattleback Records, with a nice handful of albums. Made what is now, I guess, an annual trip to Beverly Records, which is on the far south side of Chicago. Huge place, easy place to get lost in. It's not one of those places you go if you're just, say, moseying around, oh, let me check out what's in this place. No, you got to dedicate some time to it. I walked away with a couple of brand new things and a couple of not so brand new things, including a record that might be used in this podcast later on. And that same day, got together with a couple of old friends, including my Pie Factory podcast co-host, Jim. And there's a reason I'm mentioning that, which will become apparent to you very soon. And a friend from high school, both of whom had bags of records for me that I have to go through and see what I acquired from them. And I'm very grateful to both of them for thinking of me that way. And it's been a pretty busy early winter for acquiring new records. Now, the whole reason that I had to mention Jim and Pie Factory podcast, aside from the fact that he was part of the reason that I have kind of an influx of new records to go through, is that this episode, again, it's about Conquer the Video Craze, which is a record that talks about strategies of arcade video games. We're talking old time from 1980 through 1982. And I happen to be a big fan of old video games. I grew up in that era, and I played video games like crazy, especially on my Atari 2600, which I never gave up. I still have my Atari games from childhood, and I never stopped playing them. But I loved playing arcade video games. Where I lived during the golden age of video games, at least the first golden age of video games, it was Bourbonnais, Illinois. And we didn't have really good shopping in the area. We'd actually have to drive over to Lincoln Mall in either Matson or Mattison, depending on who you talk to, Illinois, which is just inside of Cook County, not terribly far from Chicago. But we had to go all the way there, a 30-minute drive, to do our serious shopping, and we go once a month. And they had an arcade in there. Used to be called Le Mans Speedway, and it had bumper cars. But by the time I started going regularly into that arcade, they renamed it Aladdin's Castle, which of course is the famous chain of arcades you would usually see in malls. And I loved Aladdin's Castle. And the Aladdin's Castle at Lincoln Mall was huge. I mean, we're talking about a place that used to have bumper cars. By the time I started going regularly, they took out the bumper cars and they had a bunch of those sit-down cocktail style video games. But I loved going in there. It was huge. They had a video jukebox too, so you could use a token in their video jukebox so you could watch music videos. And they had all the classics. They had the games that are covered on this album that I'm about to talk about, and many more, including, they had one game that I'm going to mention later called Pac-Man and Chomp Chomp. And I think that literally was the only occurrence of that game. Sadly, I did not get to play it. The reason I didn't get to play it is because, well, my allowance at those arcades, I was a little kid. I was like 8, 9 years old. My allowance was $1. My dad would give me $1, which would give you 4 video game tokens at Aladdin's Castle. And once I spent them, that was it. No more. Couldn't get another dollar or even quarter from Dad. The only thing would be if I happened to find a loose token on the floor, or if my brother had some tokens he didn't want to use, then I could play more games. But when I saw Pac-Man and Chomp Chomp, I had already spent my $1, and my dad wouldn't give me another quarter. And he said, you could play it next time we're here. Well, next time we were there, it was gone. And that was probably a field test unit. But I mean, to be fair, Lincoln Mall wasn't the only place where I could play arcade video games. There was a convenience store just down the road from us. I remember they had a Tutankhamun, and one day I begged my dad for a quarter. He said, no, you have 20 Atari games at home. Number one, no, I didn't. I did not have 20 Atari games until 2006. Number two, say it with me, Gen Xers, it's not the same. It is definitely not the same. But once in a great while, I'd managed to finagle a quarter for that. And the Kroger, probably about a mile from home, maybe not even that far, usually had 2 arcade video games near the entrance between the doors and the cash registers. I remember they had a Deep Scan Head-On 2, 2-in-1. They had Crazy Kong at one point. At one point, they had a pirated Pac-Man machine. And they would just rotate them in and out periodically. So that was another source. We had a couple of video arcades. A couple of miles away in Kankakee, in the Meadowview Shopping Center, there was Wizard of Games, which was a very popular hangout. Sadly, my parents wouldn't take me there. And my brother would go there with his friends all the time, but he wouldn't take me. He didn't want his 10 years younger little brother tagging along with him and his friends. And eventually they opened an arcade not terribly far from where we lived. It was called Stargaze. And I actually went there once because we had a family gathering once for my brother's birthday. And he was also about to leave for the Army. And so my parents said, do you want to do anything special today? He said, yeah, I want to go to Stargaze. Let's get everybody over there. So that was the one time I went to an actual independent arcade. And that was a cool place. I remember that you could get 6 tokens for $1. So that was a pretty good deal. But other than that, my arcade gaming was limited to our monthly trips to Lincoln Mall. Nowadays, of course, there are retro arcades that feature that pay one price, play all you want because the games are on free play. There's a website that I use, Aurcade.com, AURCADE.com. And if you go there, you can actually look up and see if there's either retro arcade or some other kind of business that has arcade games nearby where you are. And I'm also fortunate enough to live by several retro arcades. Just within the city of Chicago, we have a lot of what they call beercades, which means it's actually a bar or a bar and grill that happens to have arcade video games, a lot of times on free play. They're just there to lure you in there to drink. So outside of the city, we have several options for pay one price arcades. There's Underground Retrocade, my personal favorite, out in West Dundee, Illinois, I'd say about 25 miles outside of the city. Then there's Galloping Ghost, which is the world's largest arcade. And that's in Brookfield, just south of Midway Airport, just outside of Chicago. And they just opened a new one north of Chicago in Wheeling called Headless Horseman. So I have those options, and I know I'm forgetting a lot, but they have these places all over the country. And I believe in northern England, in and around Manchester, they have Arcade Club. I think it's a pay one price place, not 100% sure, but they have them in different parts of the world. So if you're into that kind of thing, do some investigating. Sorry to ramble on like that, but this episode is basically two of my loves converging into one: records and video games. So I'm really happy to bring you my findings on Conquer the Video Craze by Curtis Hoard. Before we do, I'm going to give you a kind of a little backstory here of what was going on at the time, and I'll also talk about the video games themselves before getting too deeply into what Curtis has to say. Now, I'm just going to tell you folks right now that if you're looking for a deep history into how this record came about and the person behind it, Curtis Hoard, I'm sorry to say that, well, you're out of luck, and so am I, because, man, not for lack of trying. I sure did my best. I hope I did my best, at least. But I'll tell you about the record as it is. I shouldn't just say record, because Conquer the Video Craze was also released on a cassette tape as well. This is on the, let's see, what label is it? It is ALA Records, and the address on the label is 4218 West Jefferson Boulevard, Los Angeles, 90016. I can tell you a little bit about ALA. It was a record label that existed for a fairly short time, from the 70s to about the early 80s. And most of the records they released were music records, and a lot of R&B records and related, such as Louis Jordan. I did see in their discography that there was a record of Jimi Hendrix and Little Richard playing together, and I didn't know about that. I'm very curious. I'm going to try to track that down. I don't know much about this Curtis Hoard person. It says here that he is the author. It says that he wrote this. Interestingly, it says script Linda Drozen. So I don't know if maybe Curtis wrote up what he wanted to say and Linda actually kind of made it a little more palatable for the record market. I don't know. But it says here that Chris Hoard is an Atari Champion finalist. Don't know exactly what that means. Any research of any Atari-based competition does not have his name anywhere. And it says, due to his incredible skills, he has been employed by a large game company exclusively to test all the new games in order to establish difficulty settings. I don't know what video game company that would have been. I'm assuming video game company. There were a lot of large ones out back in the day. There was Sega, there was Atari. I don't know if they mean just arcade video games or home video games, because if it's home video games, that could also open us up to Coleco, Mattel, and other arcade manufacturers. You had Williams, you had Bally Midway, and Lord knows what else off the top of my head. But it says here there are few games in the marketplace that Curtis has not mastered. He has extensive experience at playing video games and deciphering their patterns and techniques of play. Let's see. He currently logs more than 8 hours of play per day and has been coined by his peers and friends as the human video game. That's interesting. Currently, by the way, means 1982, which is when this album came out. But yeah, I could not find anything on Curtis Hoard. I tried searching newspapers. I tried classic Googling. Good Lord. Yeah, I tried that. I tried looking him up on Facebook and other social media, and I found a lot of people named Curtis Hoard, but none that I could actually pinpoint as any kind of video game person. Now, because this is an audio podcast, I have to be as visually descriptive as I can of the record itself. Well, the front cover has a black background, and it has the title in yellow, very 80s, all uppercase, actually might even be 70s. The font is, how do I describe it? That old, like, kind of op art-y design in which the letters have lines inside them. It's hard to describe. But anyway, it says Conquer the Video Craze at the top. On the lower left, there's a yellow POW with the text, "How to Beat the Hottest Games." In the middle, there is a picture of what is supposed to, I guess, represent a portion of the arcade with a rather diverse group of people. They all look young, actually, so not age diverse. And they're playing 7 of the 8 games that are covered on this album. The one missing is Tempest. The picture is a slight fisheye circle to it, kind of like, say, the Are You Experienced album cover. And around the picture, it lists the games in kind of a dark pink font, each with a trademark symbol by them. The record label, no frills, pretty standard, actually, and the fonts are very standard as they were throughout the 80s, just a simple uppercase font. It has the ALA logo on top. It's a silver label with black text. And the back cover is also not very frilly. It's just a pretty standard plain white back with text on it. On one side, it lists all the games that are played, and on the other side, it has those liner notes that I kind of sort of read to you. And I love that it has this disclaimer: the contents of this sound recording are not authorized by any video game manufacturer or distributor. I guess the same could be said about this episode. But the record itself, it's spoken word. It is a narrator, a male narrator, could be Curtis Hoard, could be somebody else, talking about, let's see, there are 8 different video games: Centipede, Defender, Stargate, Dig Dug, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, and Tempest. And before I get into what he has to say about all these games, I'll give you a little bit of a background on arcade history. I'm not guaranteeing that this is 100% complete, and I'm not an expert. I'm just a big fan of classic video games, which is why I'm a co-host of a classic video game podcast called Pie Factory Podcast. I just wanted to maybe establish a little bit of a background and maybe debunk a couple of myths here and there. First of all, what's the first arcade video game? And everybody's probably say Pong, Atari's game, and that is not correct, actually. Pong was definitely an early one. It came out in 1972, but before that, there was Computer Space, and it was based on another game that was developed inside a lab. The video game arcades really started to take off in the late 70s, when you had games like Asteroids and Space Invaders, and you had Breakout, which came out in 1976. Arcades were popping up all over the place in the early 80s, and the thing is, around 1983, there was what is known as the North American video game crash. It affected both home video games and arcades. And what caused the video game crash? I don't care what anybody tells you. It was not Pac-Man for the Atari 2600. Even though a lot of people hated it, it sold a lot. It sold millions. It was also not ET for the Atari 2600, which, by the way, I can definitively tell you, despite popular belief, it is not by far the worst video game ever released. There are far worse on the Atari 2600 and other video game consoles. But speaking of video game consoles, that is a big part of what led to the North American video game crash. There were so many consoles out there that you could play. There was the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, Atari 5200, ColecoVision, Vectrex. That's 5 video game consoles right off the top of my head that were out at the time of the North American video game crash. And when you had 5 different consoles and a video game craze, you had everybody wanting to get a little piece of it. Especially on the Atari 2600, there was a flood of, well, let's just face it, crap video game cartridges available for sale, mostly by fly-by-night companies. I want to say at one point there were video game cartridges for the Atari 2600 numbering in the hundreds. We're talking 600 or more. The market was flooded with third-party cartridges made by not only fly-by-night companies, but also companies who shouldn't have been making video games, like, say, Ralston Purina. And perhaps an even bigger player in the North American video game crash was the advent of at least somewhat affordable home computers. Home computers could play video games, but they could also do other things, like spreadsheets. They could do word processing. And of course, in the early 80s, the marketing told you, hey, ladies, you could also store your recipes on a computer, which is really handy if you decide to set up your computer in the kitchen, I guess. So your computer can do all of this for X amount of dollars, which many families thought, wow, that's actually a pretty good investment. Hey, you know that video game system you want, Johnny? Forget it. We're getting a computer instead. You can play games on that. So not only is it that you had home computers that could play video games, but also some of the video game consoles, particularly the ColecoVision and Atari 5200, the games you could get for those systems were very, very similar in quality to the actual arcade games. So why would you want to go out and spend money at the arcade when you could play the same games in very similar quality at home? I personally didn't really notice that there was a video game crash happening back in 1983. I don't know why. I was perhaps too young to notice. I did notice that arcades were changing and closing. Aladdin's Castle stayed open for quite a long time, at least the one at Lincoln Mall. But I noticed that the games were changing. Suddenly you couldn't play a arcade video game for a quarter. A lot of them you had to pop in 2, sometimes even more. Video games were changing. Instead of these games that you couldn't beat, you just kept popping quarters in trying to get a better score. Now you had games that would come to an end. And if you lost all your lives, there would be a little prompt on the screen that says continue. And if you wanted to continue, you'd pop another quarter in and hit the start button. So I noticed that change was happening. Now, having said all that, there has been kind of another golden age of arcade video gaming in recent years. Now, does that mean that arcade video games were built to last? No, they were specifically not built to last. Because think about it. You're an arcade game manufacturer. Do you want to build something that's going to last? No, because you have new games that you want to sell. Arcade operators and bar owners where you have video games, they noticed that, hey, once a game was played enough, people would stop playing it because they were tired of it, so they'd want new games. So, of course, these machines were not built to last. Yes, there are thousands of them that are still operational. That's partially luck, and it's also partially dedicated maintenance because arcade video machines are difficult to maintain. You got to know how to repair them. You got to know how to address the wear and tear on the control panels. And if the monitor goes out, you got to find something to replace it. And if you're going for that classic look, good luck finding a cathode ray tube monitor that still works. I know a lot of people who, when they repair video games, a lot of times they have to use a modern PC or TV set to use as a monitor because you just can't get those cathode ray tubes anymore. They're not made anymore. Those who are able to repair monitors with cathode ray tube monitors, they're just salvaged from other games. That's all there is to it. But I'm glad that these games are available to play, and you can even play them at home. Modern consoles now have a lot of compilations from the old video game manufacturers, like there are Midway compilations, there are Namco compilations, there are numerous Atari compilations, and even then there are emulators you can download. The most popular, of course, being MAME, Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, and you can download what are called ROM files so that you can play the actual arcade games on your computer. But getting back to the Conquer the Video Craze record, I'm going to go through the games that Curtis whoever narrates it. I'm just going to assume for now that it's Curtis. Just know that it might not be Curtis Hoard himself. It might be somebody else narrating his words. That's right, I'm assuming that the narrator is Curtis Hoard, even though the narrator refers to Curtis Hoard in the third person, so I can't really assume it's Curtis Hoard, but I don't care. I'm going to just pretend, whether I'm right or wrong, that the person speaking on this record is Curtis Hoard. But I'll get into the video games that Curtis talks about and what he has to say, and I'll give you a little bit of background about them. Starting with Centipede. Most people who've played video games know what Centipede is. It's a video game that Atari came out with in 1981, I believe. There's a right-handed trackball and a fire button, and your character moves around the bottom part of a screen and shoots at various bugs. Your goal is to completely destroy a centipede made up of 12 pieces. There are mushrooms scattered around the field, and basically the mushrooms act as ways to in a way, steer the centipede down the screen toward you. There are fleas that appear every now and then that deposit mushrooms, and there are spiders that appear at the bottom of the screen. And if any of these enemies touch you, you lose a life. Centipede was designed by Donna Bailey, who wanted to make sure that there was a game out there that women could appreciate. She designed Centipede as a bug game because she figured, well, what do women like? They like the concept of bugs being dead. So she thought that way it would appeal to women, and also she designed a color palette that had a lot of pastels that she figured, well, women are going to like this. The game itself was based on Space Invaders. And when you think about it, it really is Space Invaders, the invaders being the centipede. And you know those shields in Space Invaders that a lot of players like to shoot away because they get in the way? That's what the mushrooms are. And you know what the UFO is in Space Invaders? In Centipede, that's a scorpion that appears now and then. It runs across the screen and poisons the mushrooms, which make the centipede go straight down to the bottom of the screen. So yeah, it's definitely based on Space Invaders. And fun fact, Space Invaders is based on Breakout. But I'm not going to get into that detail right there. The next game that Curtis talks about is Defender, which was released in 1981 by Williams Electronics, who were located here in Chicago until just a few years ago, actually. And the game was created by Eugene Jarvis and Larry DeMar. In Defender, you control a spacecraft that you fly around a mountainous region. It's what we call a horizontal scrolling shooter because you move from right to left or left to right. And you have to protect 10 humanoids on the ground. Why do you have to protect them? Because you have these alien landers who come in and try to beam them up, bring them to the top of the screen, and then convert them to mutants. If a lander grabs one of the humans, you got to shoot that lander and then rescue the humanoid before it hits the ground and dies. On the top of the screen, there's a scanner that shows you the entire region that you are defending, not just what's on your screen, but what's off your screen too. So you can see what's going on. You can see if there's somewhere across the region where a humanoid is being kidnapped, and you can fly over and rescue the humanoid. If you fail in rescuing the humanoids and all 10 humanoids end up either dead or converted into zombies, then you are suddenly warped into this spacey zone where you are fighting against a whole horde of mutants, and that is a pain in the butt to survive. If you survive that wave, you're brought to another wave, back to the mountainous region, back with a new set of 10 humanoids that you have to defend, as it were. This game, along with many other Williams games, by the way, folks, is a real pain in the butt. It is a very difficult game, and undoubtedly, the control scheme has to do with it. The control panel consists of a two-way joystick that moves your ship up and down. There's a thrust button that moves your ship forward, left, or right, depending on where you're facing. If you want to change directions, you have to hit a reverse button that's right under the two-way joystick. Usually your thumb is a good way to do that. There is a button called Smart Bomb, and if you hit that button, everything that is currently in your area is destroyed. There's a hyperspace button. If you hit that, it warps you to a random location. And of course, there's a fire button that you use to shoot at landers, mutants, and other enemies. Among those other enemies, there's a pod, which when you shoot it, divides into small swarmers that are going to shoot at you. And those things are a real pain to destroy, so be careful with those. Now, a little story that I like to mention here. Now, something I'd like to mention about Defender is an anecdote I read shared by the operator of Silver Susie's Arcade, which was an arcade in Rogers Park on the far north side of Chicago. Susie said that Eugene Jarvis, again, the creator of Defender, was in the arcade one night and he was playing Defender, his own game. He was getting so ragingly angry at the game that he nearly pushed the game into the wall. So she had to kick him out. That's how hard the game is, that it even made the creator of the game so angry. The next game that Curtis talks about on the record is Stargate, which is a sequel to Defender, also put out by Williams in 1981. It's essentially the same game as Defender, but with a few differences. In the playfield, there is a little box called a Stargate, and what that does is it transports you to the other side of the planet you're defending. Supposedly, you enter it if a lander captures a human, and then that human ends up in the Stargate with you safely. I played this game 2 days ago, and from what I could tell, at least, Curtis's description of that does not make sense. That did not happen, at least for me. But that Stargate also acts as a warp. You enter it while carrying a certain number of humanoids, and you get bonus points and you skip waves. If the machine is set to its defaults, you have to have 4 humanoids in order to warp. Now, I told you about the Defender control panel. Well, it's got the same control panel, except there's one more button on it. Oh my goodness. And that button is called Inviso, which gives you temporary invisibility and invincibility, and whenever you collide with an enemy, the enemy will be destroyed, and you will be perfectly safe. Now, Curtis talks about 3 different types of enemies, which have different ways of killing you, essentially. Curtis says that there are Elabian, well, actually, he says Yalbillion dogfighters that just shoot at you like normal enemies.
First, there are Yalbillion dogfighters.
And I noticed when typing up the script that I'm using that the first 5 letters of Elabian are YLLAB, or Bally spelled backwards. Bally owned Midway Games, who was a rival of Williams, and Williams and Midway were located just 1.5 miles away from each other, practically down the street on the northwest side of Chicago. Curtis also said that there are space guppies which shoot smart bombs at you that follow you. Now, I think Curtis got confused here because I don't think there's such a thing as an Elabian dogfighter, but there is an Elabian space guppy, which actually does match Curtis's description of a space guppy. I think his confusion came about because there's a special wave that appears from time to time called Elabian Dogfight, and that happens on waves 5, 15, and 25. The other new enemy that Curtis describes is called a firebomber, which shoots bombs at you that are very difficult to dodge. The next game Curtis talks about is Dig Dug, which according to him was a brand new game, and at the time the record was made, it was. The game was released by Namco in 1982, and here in North America it was distributed by Atari. The object of the game is to kill enemies called pukas and figars. Figars are essentially little dragons, and you do that while you're digging underground tunnels. Actively digging the tunnel causes you to slow down a bit, and the creatures, of course, are going to move twice as fast as you at the time, but you can outrun them if you can move through an already dug tunnel. There are 2 ways to destroy the monsters. You can inflate them with a pump, or you can drop rocks on them. You get more points for dropping rocks, and the more enemies you kill in one blow, the more bonus points you get. And of course, you can only kill multiple enemies by dropping rocks on them. After you drop 2 rocks, there's a vegetable that appears in the middle of the screen, and you want to grab that thing for bonus points. Fun fact, by the way, there is a kill screen on Dig Dug. Video games sometimes have kill screens, which are called kill screens because of that screen, your game comes to an end, you lose all your lives. Kill screens are usually the results of programming bugs. And back in the early 80s, usually it involved the number 256, and Dig Dug is not an exception. If you reach level 256 on Dig Dug, then at the beginning of the level, a puka renders in the exact same place where Dig Dug is rendered, which means you die immediately. And also on that screen, the pre-dug tunnels are missing and the rocks are put in strange places. Undoubtedly, this is caused by a glitch that some people call byte rollover. I'm not going to get into the technical detail as to what that means, but basically, these games are handled by 8-bit processors, and 8-bit processors can only handle up to the number 255, and when you reach 256, they reset to 0. Problem is, the developers of Dig Dug did not think of this when designing levels. They designed level 255, and of course they did not design a level 0. The first level you start with is level 1. So when level 0 happens, there's nothing to render, so the game goes haywire, and that's what causes all that crazy stuff to happen. That's what causes the pre-dug tunnels to not happen, the rocks showing up in weird places, and Dig Dug and the puka starting off in the exact same place. That's the end of side 1. If you flip over and listen to side 2, the first game Curtis is going to talk about is Donkey Kong, which was released by Nintendo in 1981. I probably don't have to give you a lot of description about Donkey Kong. It's a 4-screen game. You control a player named Jumpman, who later became renamed Mario. That's right, Donkey Kong is the original Mario game. And he is to rescue a damsel in distress named Pauline. He does that first by climbing a series of ladders and jumping barrels. In another screen, he has to ride a series of elevators and climb ladders and avoid little springy things on the top of the screen to rescue Pauline. Another screen is commonly referred to as the pie factory, and that's what Curtis Hoard calls it, but it's really a cement factory. It's called a pie factory because there are conveyor belts that roll out what look like fresh hot pies, but they're really cement pots. And basically you have to avoid those things and climb to the top and try to rescue Pauline. And of course, there's the screen that involves you destroying rivets by walking or jumping over them, causing a series of platforms to collapse, which causes Donkey Kong to release Pauline, and you have essentially rescued Pauline at that point. That is the only screen in which you actually rescue her. Fun fact, by the way, Donkey Kong also has a kill screen, and it's pretty well known thanks to a documentary that was edited so heavily that it's actually pretty fictional, called King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters. Every screen has a countdown timer. Well, unfortunately, when you reach the 117th screen, the countdown timer gives you only 4 seconds, when it should be 260 seconds. Again, part of that 256 byte rollover. And because you only have 4 seconds, Mario is going to die. So that's the kill screen on Donkey Kong. And by the way, when Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the designers of Donkey Kong, first started on the game, he was hoping to make it a Popeye game, but Nintendo could not acquire the license at the time. So he came up with an original game that was slightly influenced by Beauty and the Beast. Next up on the album, Curtis Hoard talks about Pac-Man. If you don't know how to play Pac-Man, well, all I can say is look it up. I'm not going to go over it here because it's such a massively popular game. It was when it was released by Namco in 1980 and distributed by Midway Games in North America, and it's still massively popular to this day, almost 45 years later. A couple of things I will talk about. Pac-Man, just as with Dig Dug and Donkey Kong, has a kill screen. It's a very famous kill screen. If you're a skilled enough Pac-Man player that you survive 255 screens, guess what happens? When you reach 256, things go haywire because, according to the game's machine, you're actually at level 0 at that point, but the programmers did not think to put a level 0 in. They started at level 1. What happens is half the screen renders properly graphically. The left half does. The right half, though, it's a mess. It's a bunch of random gibberish and symbols and letters and numbers and things that seemingly constantly change. And basically, it's not really playable. And because that split screen essentially ends the game, there is a maximum score that you can get on Pac-Man, assuming you get all the dots, all the monsters. And by the way, those enemies are monsters. They are not ghosts. The term ghosts came about with the Atari 2600 home version to basically explain why the characters flicker a lot. But on the arcade version, they are monsters. It says so on the bezel. It says so on the Japanese version of the game too. They are monsters. I do not care what anybody tells you about. The highest score you can ever achieve on a standard Pac-Man machine is 3,333,360. The first person for whom we have rock-solid evidence that actually happened was from Rick Fothergill. And the fastest time to get that perfect score was done by David Race, who took 3 hours, 28 minutes, and 49 seconds to get that perfect score. Another myth I want to at least call into doubt is that the creator of Pac-Man, Toru Iwatani, got the idea for Pac-Man while eating a pizza with a slice missing. That is most likely not true. It's a story made up for public relations. The word on the street, actually, is that what inspired Toru Iwatani to make Pac-Man's mouth constantly open and close was basically to mock Americans, because apparently we just can't shut up. Well, given how long I've been rambling about this podcast, I think he's right. The next game that Curtis talks about on the record is Ms. Pac-Man. And those of you who are major Pac-Man fans, what I'm about to say is something you already know, but this is for people who are unaware, is that Ms. Pac-Man is not a 100% official Pac-Man sequel. I'll tell you the story about that as briefly as I can. Ms. Pac-Man came about thanks to a bunch of college students. They actually had a game room set up in their residence hall, and one of the games in the game room was Missile Command. Well, they found that Missile Command eventually wasn't making all the money that it used to. People weren't playing it as much because, well, they were getting bored with it. So these college students devised a hack that made the game more interesting, more difficult, more challenging, and suddenly people started playing it again, and that hack was called Super Missile Attack. Around the same time, they devised a hack for Pac-Man, and it was called Crazy Otto. Well, around the same time, Pac-Man was getting a reputation for being, well, boring, because especially more eagle-eyed players noticed that the monster's movements were very predictable, and people were able to devise patterns that would allow them to rack up huge scores, and people eventually just got bored with it because it wasn't challenging anymore. So these same people who devised Super Missile Attack came up with a hack of Pac-Man. This hack introduced 3 additional maze patterns. After you cleared a certain number of racks, the maze would change. Instead of the bonus prize just hovering in one place under the monster's hideout, the bonus prize would enter through a tunnel and then exit through the other. And they made one of the monsters a little bit more unpredictable in his movement habits, so the game was random and could not be reliably patterned. In the meantime, Midway Games, who distributed Pac-Man in North America, was getting concerned because people were getting tired of Pac-Man. Also, they had this idea that Pac-Man was luring women into arcades, and if people were getting bored with Pac-Man, by default, that would mean women are getting bored with Pac-Man, so they're losing their female customers. Of course, there's not really a lot of evidence to believe that Pac-Man was attracting women into arcades because they were already going to arcades with or without Pac-Man in there. Midway raised their concerns to Namco over in Japan, and Namco said, "Yes, we're well aware of that. Don't worry, we already have a sequel in the works." Meantime, there's no sequel coming out. Midway reaches out to the people in Japan, "Hey, how's that sequel going?" "Well, we're still working on it. In the meantime, though, the folks at Midway happened upon Crazy Otto, and they looked at it and said, "Wait, this is Pac-Man, but it's so much better. It's much more attractive." Now, I should mention that Crazy Otto was a yellow character who walked around the maze and had legs. Looked like a Pac-Man with legs, essentially. And instead of monsters, there were goblins following Crazy Otto around the maze. But other than that, it was essentially a fancified version of Pac-Man. Midway liked it. They reached out to those college students who hacked Pac-Man into Crazy Otto. That group of students became a company called GCC, by the way. And they said, "Hey, we would like to modify your hack so that it's an actual Pac-Man game." And GCC said, "Ooh, that sounds like a good idea." So Midway and GCC got together, changed the goblins back to monsters, changed Crazy Otto back to a Pac-Man character, but put a beauty mark, eyebrows, lipstick, a bow, and hair. Basically made the character a woman. There was a dispute over what to call her. Would it be Miss Pac-Man, Mrs. Pac-Man? Well, we can't have this character called Miss Pac-Man because eventually in one of the cutscenes, Pac-Man and this other character have a child. We cannot have an unmarried couple have a child. The compromise was reached that they would call the character Ms. M.S. Pac-Man due to the women's movement that had been going on since the 70s, what with Ms. Magazine and all. So Midway and GCC came up with a final design, took it over to Namco in Japan. Namco looked at it and they said, tell you what, lose the hair and you have our blessing. So Midway did that. They redesigned Ms. Pac-Man without the hair. And then they released Ms. Pac-Man in 1981, and it was a huge, huge, huge hit. And by the way, if you ever want to challenge somebody and ask them a little trivia question and say, what was the first official Pac-Man sequel? Well, you could argue that it's actually Super Pac-Man, which was the next Pac-Man game that Namco put out. The only official Pac-Man games that Namco themselves released were Pac-Man, Super Pac-Man, Pac-and-Pal, Pac-Land, and Pac-Mania. I'm not counting the more modern multiplayer versions that are out there, just say the original batch. But here in America, we had Ms. Pac-Man. We had exciting new Pac-Man Plus. We had the Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man pinball machine. There was a pinball video game hybrid called Baby Pac-Man. And at least one test location, a hacked version of Pac-and-Pal that was called Pac-Man and Chomp Chomp. And there was also Junior Pac-Man, which was essentially like Ms. Pac-Man, but it had scrolling mazes that were a beast to clear. Well, the folks in Japan were not happy with Midway putting out all those unauthorized Pac-Man games, most of which were just hacks of the original Pac-Man game, so they rescinded Midway's license to release Pac-Man games, which is why when Pac-Mania came out, I think in 1987, it was distributed in North America by Atari and not by Midway. But yeah, several of those games I mentioned, Ms. Pac-Man, Pac-Man Plus, Junior Pac-Man, those were just hacks of the original Pac-Man game. And really, if you ever see one of those games out in the wild, it's really just a Pac-Man cabinet with an add-on box attached to the motherboard. The next and final game talked about on this record is Tempest, a vector graphics game by Atari. And by vector graphics, what I mean is that the graphics are rendered on a special monitor and they are drawn according to mathematical coordinates, unlike your other kind of screen, which is a raster screen. Basically, if you're out in the wild and you see a classic video game that's basically just a bunch of lines and not filled in polygons and things, that's probably a vector game. Asteroids and Asteroids Deluxe and Space Duel are other examples. The Star Wars games from back in the early 80s, those are vector graphics games. But for Tempest, as Curtis says,
in this game, the object is for you to kill everything coming at you on the screen and to avoid being killed.
That's the short story there. You control a claw-shaped blaster ship that moves around the outer perimeter of a wireframe tunnel while various types of enemies emerge and head toward the outside of the tunnel and try to kill you. The main type of enemy is the flipper, so called because it moves in a flipping motion around the tunnel as it moves closer and closer to your blaster. The flipper is going to try to capture your blaster and drag it inside the tunnel, at which point you're dead, you lost a life. There are also pulsars, which temporarily electrify lines, and if you cross over any of those electrified lines, you lose a life. There are fuse balls, which come at you in seemingly random patterns, spikers, which are enemies that will plant growing spikes in the tunnel, which is important to keep in mind because when you finish a level, your blaster travels through the tunnel, and if it runs into one of those spikes, you lose a life. Just make sure that you're out of the way of the spikes when the level ends. Then you have tankers, which are magenta, three-dimensional diamond shapes that when you hit with a shot, or if they reach the outer perimeter, they split into two flippers. There are also fuseball tankers and pulsar tankers, which split into two fuseballs and two pulsars, respectively. Now, I said that there are 16 different screens, and they each have a different tunnel design. When you reach level 17, the tunnel pattern starts over with the first, albeit with increased difficulty. You move your ship around the tunnel with a rotary controller that goes 360 degrees, and you use the fire button to shoot at the enemies. And there's also a button that will fire a super zapper, of which you get 2 per level. The first super zapper that you fire destroys everything that's currently on the screen, and the second super zapper that you fire, only a handful of the enemies that are on the screen. Now, those are the games that Curtis talks about. And you'll notice that I didn't really talk much about the strategies that he recommends, and there's a reason for that. I'm saving that for a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to go into what I like to call Sean's record collecting thoughts. As of this episode of My Weird Record Collection, the podcast is a year old. And given that it's a new year, and I've gathered more social media followers, and that, well, there's simply been an entire year for people to discover this podcast, I would like to explain basically the kinds of records that I will not cover on this podcast. I mean, usually I take this opportunity to give you some tips on, I don't know, cleaning your records, how to buy records at a reasonable price, and quite often I would even provide links where you can buy the products, sometimes from Amazon, which would give me a little chunk of the sale without any additional cost to you. So if I open up my spreadsheet here and see how much I've made off of that, let's see, I reference the standard deviation here, apply the mantissa, and carry the 4, and I've made exactly $0.00 from those sales. So there. Now, having said all that, generally, you're not going to hear me talk about mainstream records by mainstream artists. I know, you saw my promo video and saw the Beach Boys' Smiley Smile among the weird records I was flipping through, but that was just a joke. The closest I've come to mainstream was Reach by Richard Simmons. Even though I did that episode when I did it was simply because he died and I wanted to pay some kind of tribute to him, that was always among the records that I planned to cover. But the thing about Reach is that it was Richard Simmons singing. So basically, if you do hear me talk about a record by a mainstream artist, it's because that mainstream artist is doing something you don't expect said mainstream artist to do. That having been said, no, I'm not going to talk about, say, The Transformed Man by William Shatner or any of Leonard Nimoy's albums or anything else Golden Throats related, mainly because as absurd as those things are, they have become exposed and discussed to the point that they are now mainstream, really. If you heard episode 3 of this podcast, the Auto Harp episode, you might remember that I actually got some help from Meg Peterson, the narrator of Tuning Your Auto Harp. She's 96 years old, going to be 97 this year. Well, one day she called me and said, "Hey, Sean, I happened upon a couple of Tom Lehrer records in my collection and wanted to see if you were interested. Do you consider these to be weird? Is this material for your podcast?" Well, I respectfully declined for 2 reasons. Number 1, I already had said records. I'm a big Tom Lehrer fan. And number 2, not weird. Funny? Absolutely. But too mainstream. After all, Songs by Tom Lehrer was a huge seller. So generally, comedy records not in the domain of this podcast. However, I will say this. One of the reasons I have a passion for the records that I do talk about is that many of them have unintentional comedy. Wait till you hear my episode about the Columbia School of Broadcasting.
And that is lazy mouth.
But I guess a way to think about this is, if it's something you're very likely to hear Dr. Demento play on a somewhat regular basis, I'm very unlikely to talk about it here. Now, I probably mentioned this before, but one thing I will likely not talk about in this podcast, JFK memorial albums. I mean, yeah, you usually do see them in the same sections of the record store where I find the weird records that I talk about, but here's the thing. They're a dime a dozen. I see the same ones almost every single time I go record shopping in any record store I've been to in the United States. It's just crazy how these record companies were all trying to capitalize off of JFK's death. I might bite the bullet and pick up one of those JFK albums just to see what it's all about and just out of curiosity, but still, because they're so ubiquitous, I don't really plan to dedicate an entire episode to any of them. Did I talk about a JFK record on this podcast? Yes, episode 11, but that was because it was not a memorial record, but a campaign record that was pressed in limited quantities for targeted distribution, and it wasn't something you would see out in the wild every day. Still not. It was an unusual curiosity. Also, there was an album that I did buy a few years ago that I had in consideration for the podcast until I listened to it, and I very strongly decided against it. And I almost immediately, at a loss of only a few bucks, resold the album on Discogs. I'm talking about The Satanic Mass. It was a reissue of a recording of a mass celebrated by the Church of Satan in San Francisco in, I think, 1969, with Anton LaVey himself, the founder, as the celebrant. It was on red vinyl, which of course tempted me because I love non-black colored vinyl, but it wasn't pressed very well. It had a lot of wow and flutter. And also, quite honestly, folks, it creeped the hell out of me. I mean, the Church of Satan is actually an atheist organization and they don't do devil worship, but the way the album was recorded and engineered, and with the creepy organ and the echo on Anton LaVey's voice, you would be led to believe otherwise, and I just couldn't deal with it. And also, I thought about how it might look for some people to have the phrase Church of Satan associated with this podcast, so I figured, I better pass on it. What about sound effects records? You usually see those in or near the same sections where I find my weird records. Well, no. I never had the slightest interest in those things, either as weird records or otherwise. There are so many of those. It's insane. Even if I wanted to use them in, say, podcasting, well, don't need them. All I need to do is go to YouTube and grab any sound I'm looking for. But hold on, Sean. How about episode 6? Well, good job calling me out on that one. But the records that I talked about on that episode weren't really sound effects records. The records were more aimed at people who had 8mm home movies, and they were pushed on people to add soundtracks to their home movie presentations when they roped their friends visiting into watching their home movies. I bought those records mainly for the silly, cheesy musical soundtracks rather than the few sound effects they offered. Records from sound effects libraries that, say, radio stations would use, those were one thing. But records made for playing them during home movies, well, that's another. But I guess a good way to describe the kinds of records that I like to talk about in this podcast is that, well, if you see a record in the store and wonder why in the world somebody would put that particular material on record, and even more so, why in the world someone bought it, because, hey, if you see it in a used record store, someone probably bought it at some point and it's up for resale. Well, chances are I'm interested. That's not the only criterion, but it's certainly a big one. If it's not a mainstream record and it makes you think, oh, this is so place year here, then it's probably a good candidate for this podcast. Or if you spot a record in public and your immediate reaction is to say out loud, what the hell is this? Well, welcome to the world of weird records. If you've listened to at least one episode of this podcast before, except for episode 13 maybe, you know that I like to rate each record that I talk about on 5 different factors. Each factor gets a score of 1 through 5 inclusively, and the higher number means better, as you probably guessed. What are those factors? Those factors are local interest or usefulness. I pick one or the other, sometimes I average both. Here, there's no locality involved other than maybe North America, really, so I'm not going to consider local interest. I'll go straight on usefulness on this record, and I'm also going to take into account the historical interest of Conquer the Video Craze, so that's 2 factors. The other factors I rate the records on are their uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability, meaning that each record that I rate will get a composite score of somewhere between 5 and 25 inclusive. Let's start with usefulness. This, my friends, is why I didn't talk about the strategies that Curtis talked about yet, because I wanted to save them for this portion of the episode. Now, the thing is, when rating the usefulness of Conquer the Video Craze, I had to think about it, and I think I came up with a way of rating this that's perfectly reasonable. Because this is an album of video game strategies, I decided I would rate the usefulness of the strategies on each of the 8 video games. So that's 8 usefulness ratings, and I will average them together to get a final usefulness rating. Now, I personally tried each of the strategies on all 8 games on actual arcade cabinets. Let's start with the first one, Centipede. Curtis Hoard recommends a classic Centipede strategy that has been used for decades. Well, of course, back then it was only used for about a year, probably, but it's a very well-known strategy. Many people use it, including me. He recommends that in Centipede, you build a tube through the mushrooms by simply shooting away all the mushrooms that are underneath what's essentially the thousands digit of the high score. So when you're playing Centipede, whenever you're free to do so, position your character directly underneath that thousands digit of the high score and shoot the mushrooms out of the way, just in that one row under that number. Eventually, you'll have a little tunnel, a little tube that will basically guide the centipede straight to your character, giving you an easy shot at knocking away all the parts of the centipede. And if centipede parts turn into mushrooms that are in the way of the tube, just shoot them away. That's all you do. Using just that one strategy, I was able to increase my best centipede score from a 5-digit number to about 262,000. So this is a perfectly valid strategy. Curtis Hoard also recommends that you clear away as many mushrooms as you can in the bottom 5 rows of the playfield. That is another very common strategy, and he's absolutely right, because when you have a lot of mushrooms down there, it's going to make you an easy target because you won't be able to move around very much, so clear away as many mushrooms as you can down there. They're going to regenerate when you knock off centipede pieces that get down there. The fleas are going to come and drop some centipede pieces in there too. Just blow them away whenever you can. Those are 2 very well-known strategies that are very effective. Now, remember how I said I was going to give each of these strategies its own rating and then average them out? You might think I'm going to give this strategy a 5 out of 5. No, I'm not, and I'll tell you why. It's because Curtis said that if you use this strategy, you'll find your games lasting an hour or even longer. I have been using these strategies for 10 years, my friends. I've yet to have a game that goes over, say, 20 minutes at the most. My highest score, 262,000. I can get that in 15, 20 minutes. Mind you, I only play Centipede 1 day out of the month every month because I don't have an arcade cabinet here and I don't have a good trackball to use in MAME. So I have to wait for a trip to the arcade to do it. So maybe if I played more, sure. But they are still good strategies to use. I recommend them personally. I'm going to rate Curtis's Centipede strategies a 4 out of 5. Now let's talk about Defender. Defender, as I said before, is an insanely hard game, so hard that it actually caused its creator to lose his temper and get kicked out of an arcade back in the early 80s. One of the strategies that Curtis recommends is always fly at the horizon level, because landers will be just above and just below the horizon level above the mountains. That strategy, I can kind of see, because in games like Defender, where there are things flying around, there are projectiles coming at you, if you move around too much, you're going to die. He also says destroy the landers as quickly as possible to prevent other enemies called baiters from coming out. And baiters are pretty hard to destroy. I will give him that. That strategy I agree with. Definitely get rid of the landers as soon as possible. Curtis mentions that after the first wave, there's an enemy called a pod, which, like I said before, when you shoot it, it divides into swarmers and they're going to shoot at you. He recommends getting behind the swarmers so that they can't shoot at you and then kill them from behind. I was unable to do that, to be quite honest. And then he says for wave 3, wait for 3 pods to appear and then use a smart bomb to wipe them out and you get a 5,000 point bonus. Excellent. The benefit of doing that is that if you destroy a pod with a smart bomb, it does not split into swarmers. I am sure he's right about that. But here's the thing. Using Curtis's strategies actually lowered my average score. I know that when you learn new things, you got to practice them before you get used to them, but I played probably about 15 games of Defender trying these new strategies, and I just could not get past, say, 11,000 points. Mind you, my personal best is only 16,000 in Defender because it's so friggin' hard. So yeah, from my own experience, I'm giving the Defender strategies a usefulness rating of 2. Now, moving on to Stargate, you would think that after I talked about how insanely difficult Defender is and that Stargate has now one additional button you have to worry about, so more things on the control panel, that it would be harder. But most people who play Defender and Stargate feel that Stargate is actually an easier game, and so do I. Now, Curtis says that for Stargate, use the same strategies that you use for Defender, but he also recommends doing the following. Use the warp to increase your score, which is a great idea. He says you need to gather 2 humans or men and then enter the Stargate, but the problem is, like I said before, if the machine is on its default settings, you actually need to gather 4 humanoids in order to do that warp. In the machine that I played, it was set to the default settings, so I had to gather 4 humanoids. The problem with that is it is insanely difficult. You have to be at least an average player to be able to do that. The problem with that is if you use the Defender strategies of, say, blowing away all the landers, you're never going to be able to grab those 4 humanoids because the landers who grab them are going to be gone. And even if you wait, number 1, you're taking a chance on those humanoids to be converted into mutants. And number 2, that puts you in high risk of getting killed. So you might never be able to get that warp done in the first place unless you're an expert. He says for the dogfighter showdown waves, just blast everything away, fire at any and every enemy. And for the firebomber showdown, your smart bomb will be your friend. I can't vouch for that. I could never reach that high. So I don't know. After wave 10, Curtis recommends using standard Defender strategies, but he warns that the mutants are much faster in this game and will be easier to fend off with Inviso. The mutants are definitely faster in Stargate, even at the early waves, much earlier than, say, wave 10. But again, I couldn't get past wave 10, so I cannot say for sure. But basically going with that strategy of warping, I really think that unless you're an expert player, that is only going to work on machines that are set to allow you to get into the Stargate with 2 humanoids. So for the Stargate strategies, I rate the usefulness a 2. Now for Dig Dug, this is an interesting situation because right off the bat, Curtis says that it's a brand new game. It really is a brand new game because he doesn't really offer many strategies. The only thing he tells you really is if you're not an experienced Dig Dug player, just blow away all the monsters as quickly as possible using your pump, which I can agree with. And if you are comfortable enough playing Dig Dug that you can drop boulders on the enemies, then do that and use your pump not to destroy the enemies, but just to inflate them so that for a short time they will not hurt you. It's a good way to basically make them freeze for a few seconds. So yeah, that's okay, but still it's a cop-out strategy. There are so many other strategies you can use that unfortunately I don't know off the top of my head. I know that Dig Dug is patternable to a degree. He doesn't talk about the bonus points you get for offing more than one enemy at a time. So really, the Dig Dug portion of the album really leaves a lot to desire, so I'm going to rate that usefulness a 2. Now for Donkey Kong, he offers strategies for all 4 of the screens. For the barrel jumping screen, Curtis basically has you going up the first ladders that you encounter on every level of the screen, but at the second to the last level, you're making some pauses at appropriate times to let barrels go by. The problem with this strategy, though, is that it includes a rather risky move that requires that you go up a ladder, and the timing is such that if you're the slightest nanosecond off, you lose a life because you'll be right between 2 barrels, and if you make the slightest hesitation, you're dead. Another big problem with this strategy is that what Curtis describes, if your timing is dead on perfectly accurate, it will work. But the problem is, number 1, that will only work on the barrel screen on the first level. Once you get past that first barrel screen, you're never going to be able to use that strategy again. Another problem is that some Donkey Kong machines come with what is called hard ROMs. That means that the machine has a harder difficulty. I've tried it on the harder ROM set, and yeah, that strategy does not work. I would tell you a strategy for this screen, but it's very hard to describe on an audio podcast. I would have to show you video. Moving on to the rivet screen, or as Curtis calls it, the cave-in screen, because your ultimate goal is to make a building cave in, really. Well, he doesn't really offer a real strategy for the rivet screen. He doesn't even mention this little fact about the rivet screen. Whatever side of the screen you're on at the time as Mario, the fireballs generate on the other side. For example, if you're on the right side of the screen, the next time a fireball generates, it'll be on the left side, and vice versa. If you're on the left side of the screen and a fireball generates, it's going to generate on the right side. Curtis also did not mention this little trick that was discovered, and this was definitely known at the time, that if on the rivet screen you position Mario very close to Donkey Kong's foot, either the left foot or the right foot, without getting killed, you can rack up a bunch of extra points simply by hitting the jump button and then almost immediately tapping the joystick to the left or to the right. Once you get the timing down there, you can rack up a crap ton of points, even more points than you would get if you were to get the maximum number of bonus points from the countdown timer. I've done it many, many, many times. It's a good strategy to build up your score. The elevator screen. I have to confess, there is a strategy that Curtis offers, but I couldn't really make any sense of it. It was so confusing simply because he's trying to do it over audio, but you really need video to explain any elevator screen strategy because, well, it's hard to follow. There's so much going on and so much timing involved. You cannot possibly, as far as I'm concerned, the fourth screen, the pie factory, as he calls it, and many people call it colloquially, but it's really a cement factory. The only real strategy Curtis tells you is to stay to the right as much as you can so you can avoid the fireballs that are on the left side of the screen. And to get to Donkey Kong, you use the ladder that keeps going up and down. And yeah, that's true. Not really a heck of a lot of strategy there. Overall, honestly, folks, Curtis's Donkey Kong strategy here, there's almost no strategy whatsoever. I'm giving that usefulness rating a 1. Moving on to Pac-Man. Again, he doesn't really offer much. I mean, it's helpful if you're brand new at playing Pac-Man or you never really gave it much thought when you played it. One basic strategy he offers is to clear as many dots as possible and hold off on eating the energizers, which is true. And when you do eat energizers, wait until the monsters, or as he calls them, creatures, are nearby. So that way you can eat as many monsters as you possibly can. And that's true. That is a good strategy. You don't want to go to an energizer right at the beginning of the level. Another basic strategy that Curtis offers, do not let an energizer be the last dot on the screen, or else once you eat that energizer, the level's over and you won't be able to eat any monsters and score points, which is very true. Now here's the thing. Curtis describes in detail a pattern that he uses on what he calls the first version of the game, saying that the pattern is useless on later modifications. There's a problem though. He doesn't actually explain how to tell what version of the game you are using. I have heard something that there is a way you can tell by looking at the attract mode and seeing how the demo game works, seeing what steps are taken, you can tell which version of the game it is, but he doesn't tell you how. Even bigger problem. The pattern that he describes, and I've tried this many, many times, is literally impossible. If you're watching this on YouTube, you will see what I mean. Here's what he has to say.
Start by going to the right, to the wall. Then down and around the bottom, going right to left. Go to the second opening and go up. Then a right and a quick up, then left eating dots. Go up a second opening in which you are eating dots. Cut right toward the inside and go up and left and up again eating dots.
It is not doable. It is literally not possible to do that with the layout of the maze. I was actually originally going to give his strategy for Pac-Man a 3, but then I realized he doesn't deserve a 3 because he gave literally an impossible strategy, a strategy that cannot be done on any version of the game. So actually my rating for his Pac-Man strategy gets a 2. For Ms. Pac-Man, Curtis reiterates the basic strategies from Pac-Man, which is true. You definitely want to save the energizers for later, and you definitely don't want the last dot that you eat to be an energizer. He gives different strategies for different mazes. For the first maze, he suggests starting from the bottom line of dots and working your way to the top, which actually, is a good strategy because on the bottom of the screen, it's really easy to get trapped. And when the level starts, not all the monsters are out of the hideout yet. So you want to clear out that hard part before all the monsters come out of their hideout. For the second maze, Curtis recommends going to the top middle portion of the screen where there's that T-shaped island. He says go there as soon as possible and clear it before all the creatures, as he says, emerge from their starting point in the middle of the maze. The version of Ms. Pac-Man I played at the beginning of the second maze, all the monsters came out at once, but I still tried that strategy, and I gotta say, I'm really happy with it. That worked really well. For the third maze, there's a similar kind of upside down T shape, but it's right underneath Ms. Pac-Man's starting position, and it's in a box, really. Curtis recommends clearing out that space first, and I agree with him. Not only do I agree with clearing out that space first, but I'm actually going to add never enter it again once you clear it, or else you're in severe danger of getting trapped. He also talks about what he calls switchbacks, which are portions of the maze where the gaps between the walls happen too suddenly for the monsters to be able to enter, and those are usually safe for Ms. Pac-Man to go through. Problem is, he gives no indication as to what portions of the maze he's talking about. He might be talking about those short J-shaped islands to the left and right of the monster's hideout, but I can't be 100% sure. Now, a glaring omission that Curtis has in his strategy, there's no mention of the fourth maze, which tells me he may have never seen that. At the very least, he should have at least mentioned it if he was familiar with it. That would give him a little bit more credibility. Now, here's the thing. I was tempted to give Curtis's Ms. Pac-Man strategies a 3 because they're pretty good, and he missed a couple of very important things you should keep in mind. And this is true for both Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. While you're eating dots, your character slows down a little bit. So you got to watch out for that. Another basic thing to keep in mind is that if you turn a corner, it gives you a little bit more breathing room between you and the monsters. So if you're being tailed, turn a corner and you'll survive a little bit longer. One other thing that he didn't mention that he should have, and this is true for Pac-Man and every hack of Pac-Man, if you find yourself stuck between two monsters who are coming at you from both ends and there's no way out, don't just backtrack or go back and forth on the joystick. Instead, just keep going because there's a slight chance that you might go right through the monster unharmed. And there's a scientific reason for that, and I know that if I explained it, I'd get it wrong. But let's just say it's because of the way the graphics are drawn at a particular time that under certain circumstances, if Pac-Man or Ms. Pac-Man or Junior Pac-Man has a head-on collision with a monster, once in a great while, they'll pass right through each other and your character is unharmed. But since, hey, Curtis never thought to mention any of these facts, any of these strategies, I'm knocking my rating down to 2 for usefulness for his Ms. Pac-Man strategies. Finally, there's Tempest. There's not really a heck of a lot of strategy that Curtis offers for Tempest. I could really detect only 2 strategies, really. One of them, he recommends hitting the fire button rapidly but at an even pace. You can get 6 shots on the screen at one time. If you hold down the fire button, all 6 are going to come out really, really fast, one after the other, and you have to wait for at least one shot to disappear before you can fire again, and that can be very dangerous. He says you should only hold down the fire button, and only very briefly, if there are 2 enemies coming straight at you. You want to blow them away. He especially recommends this when there's a tanker that splits into 2 flippers. The other strategy that Curtis recommends is that except if a flipper reaches the outer perimeter and ergo is parallel with your ship and seemingly impossible to shoot, you can just stay put and use that rapid fire technique, repeatedly tapping the fire button like he said, and that the flipper will die when it crosses your path if you do that. Well, I tried that, and the truth is, about 25% of the time, I still lost a ship. So don't believe him when he says that the flipper will die. It will not necessarily die. Curtis says that if a fuse ball reaches the outer perimeter and is parallel with you, the only way to destroy it is with a super zapper. And yeah, that is absolutely true. Now, having said that, did my high score increase when I tested his strategies for Tempest? Well, the answer is no, but there's a big asterisk on that. I had not played Tempest in a very long time, so I fell out of practice and I didn't do so well, but I do have to tell you, using that fire button technique of just repeatedly tapping it rather than holding the fire button down, I actually did feel much more comfortable doing that than what I usually used to do and just hold it down. It felt like I was in better control of things, and I really liked it. I think that was a good strategy, and I think overall what he had to say for Tempest was pretty good. So I'm going to rate his Tempest strategy a 4 in usefulness. So keep that in mind. The scores that I have for usefulness, 4, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, and 4 out of 5. And if I did my math correctly, that's 19. And given that there are 8 games in which Curtis offered strategy, I'm going to divide that by 8, and the result, 2.375. Really, overall, given Curtis's general unfamiliarity with some of the terms that are actually used in the games, like the enemies in Stargate, not mentioning basic strategies in Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, and forgetting about that 4th maze in Ms. Pac-Man, assuming he knew about it at all. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that this record overall is not the most trustworthy thing in the world, hence the low usefulness rating. For historical interest, well, I had to take into consideration, is this record representative of a certain part of our times? And I really think it is. It's literally dated. It came out in 1982. Curtis said Dig Dug is a brand new game, which tells us this is definitely recorded in 1982, and it gives us a little snapshot of what the video game world was like. The golden age of arcade games was probably at an all-time high at that point, and we know that the North American video game crash would happen not terribly long after that. I'm going to give the historical interest rating a 4. Uniqueness, well, this was a tough one. Uniqueness, I'm going to have to give this record a uniqueness rating of 2 because, well, it's very findable. There are so many copies out there. Many people have it. There are many copies available for sale in various online sites. And the copy that I found at Rattleback Records was brand new. It was never, ever, ever opened. I was the first one to open it and play it. And when you go to my YouTube channel to listen to the tracks off of it, that is the first time that record was ever played. How about weirdness? Well, this one, that's another story. This record is about video games and video game strategies. What does video mean? It is a Latin word video, which means I see. Video games are to be seen. It is very hard to effectively give video game strategies on an audio medium, especially games with complicated graphic layouts, such as, say, certain levels of Donkey Kong, and of course Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. Most people, when they want video game strategies, back in 1982, when people wanted video game strategies, they'd buy a book or even a magazine. There was a magazine out called Joystick that actually had a lot of video game strategies with screen captures and everything. You need that visual element. It's kind of weird to listen to a record for video game strategies. It's very weird, in fact. And that I could not find another such record that had video game strategies, I'm going to have to say the weirdness would have to get a 4. Weirdness rating is a 4. As for enjoyability, this is a fun thing to rank on. Now, many people in the world were raised on the principle that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. Unfortunately, due to the nature of this podcast, I have to say something. The record is not enjoyable. No disrespect meant to the narrator. This is just a fact. The narrator of this record is very monotonous, no inflection whatsoever. If you do a search for this record online, you're going to hear a recurring theme of people finding the narrator boring. One comment I saw said that the person listens to the record to help him sleep. So yeah, ouch. The only thing that makes it the slightest bit listenable is that on every track, there are ambient sounds from an arcade. You don't have sound effects from the video game being talked about, just it's like someone brought a tape recorder to an arcade and hit record. So you don't have any customization or anything. And on top of that, It becomes very apparent when the narrator stops talking that there was a loose connection on the microphone or something, because you can actually hear a 60 hertz buzz. So having said that, the enjoyability on this record, I'm rating a 1, which makes this record so far the least enjoyable record of all the ones I've talked about in this podcast. So summing up the ratings of Conquer the Video Craze: 2.375 for usefulness, 4 for historical interest, 2 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 1 for enjoyability, giving Conquer the Video Craze a composite score of 13.375, which places it on my rankings right in between the 2 auto harp records I talked about in episode 3. 1 notch above Tuning Your Auto Harp, and 1 spot below Auto Harp for Students and Educators. And so concludes episode 14 of My Weird Record Collection. Do you have any thoughts on Conquer the Video Craze or anything else that's relevant to this podcast? Well, guess what? Before I tell you about next month's episode, I'm going to tell you where you can send your thoughts on this podcast. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com, and fab4it is spelled FAB, the number 4, IT. Very similar, by the way, is the URL to my website, myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. See, instead of an at, it's a dot. You can also contact me via the various social networks where my handle is My Weird Records. Look for this podcast also on Facebook. You can go to Facebook and search My Weird Record Collection, or go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. If you go to YouTube, you can listen to this podcast there as well, and you'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records that I discuss, or if not the audio itself, I will provide a playlist of the audio that I talk about. Also on my YouTube channel, I occasionally put some bonus videos of my weird and not so weird record collections as well. So you can go to YouTube and search My Weird Record Collection, or you can go straight to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection. As usual, I offer sincere thanks to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, for letting me use his record, the Pac-Man EP, as the basis for the logo for this podcast. Tim and his must-hear, oh, if you haven't heard it yet, what the heck is wrong with you, music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Big thank you also to my buddy Kevin Zerb for offering to design the logo artwork for this podcast. Thank you, Kevin. I use it proudly. Kevin and his music and podcasts and other creative endeavors are available on the web at zerbinator.com. And, next month, this episode comes out on Gloat Day, which, if you're a Peanuts fan, you know that that's February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day, when you get to gloat about all the Valentines you receive from all your admirers. So to celebrate that, I will have a record that kind of coincides with that topic in a way. So I'll join you then. Thank you for listening to this one, and until next time, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store.
The puka just flies around at you.
Why does my mouth click so much? There it goes again. Why does my mouth click? Doesn't do that when I talk to people. Does that when there's a microphone in front of me.